Hello, everyone. Thank you for making it back. I hope that you enjoyed Dr. Federici's lecture and had lots of time to continue discussing it during the break, and I encourage you to, if you didn't get a chance to ask your question during the session, I encourage you to ask him your question, whether during lunch or hospitality. So for our next lecture this morning, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Cara Rodgers. Dr. Rodgers is an assistant professor of history at Ashland University, where she teaches courses on the Age of Enlightenment, American history, and Thomas Jefferson. She has a master's degree in history from the University of Texas at Dallas and a PhD from Rice University. Her research, which focuses on race and slavery in the Jeffersonian age, has been published by the Journal of Southern History and American Political Thought. And she has also written for the Journal of Early Republic and Law and Liberty. This morning, Dr. Richards will be speaking to us on Jefferson's hopeful moment, the problem of freedom in an age of slavery, and you'll find a packet at your table. Dr. Rodgers.
Hello, everybody. It's such an honor to be here with you all. And yes, I did bring pictures to hopefully try to keep you awake in this last little bit before lunch. I am going to talk to you today about two topics, so don't get too distracted by the pictures yet. I'll kind of come to them in different points throughout the talk, and I'll tell you exactly when to turn the page. But I'm going to talk today about two topics. First, I want to talk a bit about Thomas Jefferson. And specifically, I'm going to talk about research that I've been doing into Jefferson's views on freedom, on race, and on slavery. I believe that these are important topics worthy of our consideration, not just because they're a part of American history, but because the way that we as a society remember Jefferson has a tendency to affect our culture and our politics. And that brings me to the second topic I'd like to talk about. Why is our collective memory of Thomas Jefferson so important to us Americans? In 1874, a biographer named James Parton said, "If Jefferson was wrong, America is wrong. If America is right, Jefferson was right." And that is still how many people feel today. So I want to talk briefly about the reasons for this emphasis that we Americans place on Jefferson. But first, Jefferson's views on freedom, on race, and on slavery. When we think about Jefferson, the first word that comes to mind, I think, should be freedom, because he is one of the Americans who did the most for the cause of freedom, not only here, but around the world. After all, Jefferson wrote the words in the Declaration of Independence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And he also wrote the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which begins, "Whereas Almighty God has created the mind free." This document was, to my knowledge, the first one in the history of Western civilization that guaranteed citizens of a state the right to believe whatever religion they wanted, or even no religion at all. And the ideas of this Virginia statute would later be enshrined in the First Amendment, which still guards our religious liberty to this day. Jefferson was born into power. His father was an upper-middle-class white man in colonial Virginia in a time when the land-holding class in Virginia had all the political power. But Jefferson came to support policies that expanded land ownership and therefore expanded the suffrage. He also advocated for basic public education and for scholarships for the brightest students, so that the ruling class might be composed not just of those who had the most money, but also the brightest and the most virtuous among the citizens. Whenever Jefferson saw that political reform was possible and prudent, he pushed for reform to take place, even if that meant his own personal finances and status could potentially be damaged. Okay, now the big question that everybody is asking, what about slavery? Why didn't Jefferson do more to reform slavery? Well, the record shows that during his early years, as a lawyer and as a revolutionary leader and as a diplomat, Jefferson was unabashedly opposed to slavery, and he opposed it in several different ways. We actually believe that Jefferson's anti-slavery views began here in Williamsburg when he was a student at the College of William and Mary. And then after he started practicing law, young Jefferson took on 6 freedom suits pro bono, no charge to his clients. He argued that his clients should be free from indentured servitude or slavery because, quote, "Under the law of nature, all men are born free, and everyone comes into the world with a right to his own person." However, many other Virginians rather, did not agree with this, and as far as the records show, Jefferson's efforts to free those people failed. As a young legislator in 1769, Jefferson co-sponsored an anti-slavery bill. The bill provoked scorn and anger from other members of the legislature, and it was quickly defeated. Over the next few years, he wrote a constitution for the newly independent state of Virginia, in which he included a proviso that would have abolished slavery in Virginia after the year 1800. Fortunately, his constitution was not chosen. In 1776, in his draft version of the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson denounced slavery and the slave trade. He called slavery a cruel war against human nature itself. Unfortunately, this passage was later deleted by other members of Congress, particularly South Carolina and Georgia. Then, 1784, Jefferson drafted the Northwest Ordinance, and he included a line that would have banned slavery in any territory after the year 1800. And this proviso failed by one vote. Jefferson commented on the defeat by saying, "Thus we see the fate of millions unborn hanging on the tongue of one man, and heaven was silent in that awful moment. But it is to be hoped it will not always be silent, and that the friends to the rights of human nature will in the end prevail." As president, Jefferson urged Congress to end the slave trade at the earliest moment that the Constitution allowed it. And just like he had in his first version of the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson called the slave trade violations of human rights. Unfortunately, this time enough members of Congress agreed with Jefferson that American participation in the transatlantic slave trade was banned. Now you might be thinking to yourself right about now, what about Jefferson's personal actions? Didn't he own slaves? Well, Jefferson inherited 52 enslaved individuals when he was 14 years old and his father died. And then he inherited 135 more through marriage. He bought approximately 20 people during his lifetime, and he sold several, sometimes out of financial necessity, sometimes in order to reunite enslaved people with their family members. And although Jefferson freed 5 people in his will, he did not free all of his slaves the way George Washington did. Legally, Jefferson could not, because of a law in Virginia that said if you were in debt, you could not free your enslaved property, and Jefferson died deeply in debt. So Jefferson opposed slavery, but he didn't free his slaves. And he wrote that all men are created equal, but as we shall see, Jefferson also held racist views toward Africans. Jefferson is a paradox. Was he also a hypocrite? Well, one possible way to answer that question I have found is to ask, how did the young abolitionists in Jefferson's life deal with this seeming inconsistency of his? Did his apparent hypocrisy bother them? William Short provides a fascinating example of one such man. Short was a distant relative and neighbor of Jefferson's who developed such a close relationship with the older man that Jefferson called Short his adoptive son, and Short referred to Jefferson as his father. Historians haven't really paid attention to Short. He seemed a little bit boring at first glance. He was a career diplomat, our first career diplomat. He really came out of obscurity in the 1990s when law professor Annette Gordon-Reed was doing research for a groundbreaking book about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. And she came across a letter that William Short wrote to Thomas Jefferson in 1798 when Jefferson was about to be elected the 3rd president of the United States. At the time, Short was serving as America's representative in Spain. And he wrote to tell Jefferson that there were rumors about a large city being discovered in the heart of Africa, a city larger than London. And to Short, the city refuted the European notion that Africans could only live in primitive villages. It was proof that advanced civilization was possible for Africans, and Short further believed that once Americans heard this news, they would be able to overcome their racism and realize that the slaves among them should be freed and given the full rights of citizenship. Most remarkably, Short declared that once slaves were freed, marriage between the races was the best way forward. He said marriage between the races would be much better than, quote, keeping 700,000 people and their descendants in perpetual slavery, or freeing them, but keeping them separated from the rest of the community by a marked and impassable line. And I think that's the first slide you see there, Short's handwriting, where he says that. In his attitude toward racial intermarriage, Short was way ahead of his time. In fact, Virginia did not allow white and black people to marry one another until 1967. Ever since this letter was highlighted in Gordon Reed's book a few years ago, some scholars have started to look at William Short more closely, myself included. And once you read Short's correspondence to Jefferson, it becomes apparent we can actually learn a lot about Jefferson by looking at William Short. Far from just being Jefferson's friend and secretary for a few years, it now seems that Short was a person in Jefferson's life who spoke most openly to Jefferson about some of the most controversial issues of their day. In correspondence stretching for 4 decades, these two men talked about colonization, emancipation, slave rebellions, the benefits of free versus slave labor, and sometimes even marriage between the races. Jefferson encouraged Short's anti-slavery philosophy when Short was a young man, but as the years passed, their roles seemed to have shifted somewhat. William Short, in some ways, became Jefferson's conscience on the issue of slavery, and he kept writing to remind Jefferson about this topic until the day Jefferson died. The reason why these two men were able to have such a remarkably open conversation about such difficult topics, I think, lies in their shared experiences in Europe between 1784 and 1789. For those 5 years, Jefferson was America's ambassador to France, and Short was his private secretary. During this time, Jefferson was able to talk more freely about race and slavery than he ever would again, far away from the constraints of Virginia's plantation culture, surrounded by liberal Enlightenment philosophers, and hopeful that he was about to get out of debt and therefore be able to start freeing some of his slaves. Jefferson imagined a Virginia without slavery, and he spoke freely about this with William Short. This period of time living in France was also crucial in Jefferson's life because it was while he was living in Paris that Jefferson published his only full-length book, Notes on the State of Virginia, and that, I believe, is the next slide in your packet. In it, Jefferson presented one of his strongest arguments against slavery. It was an argument designed to appeal to his fellow Virginians who had just fought a revolution based on Republican values. Jefferson said, "If you own other people, it will make you into a tyrant. Virginia's children would be, quote, nursed, educated, and daily exercised in tyranny." And even if somehow slavery did not corrupt the white population and destroy their society from within, Jefferson had an even more dire warning for them. "I tremble for my country," he said, "when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever." Jefferson predicted that when the slaves rebelled, as inevitably one day they would, God himself would be on their side. However, in addition to these eloquent anti-slavery passages, Jefferson's book included several sections summarizing and commenting on the latest in European scientific theories about race. In the late 1700s, Europeans and Americans typically believed that the white race was the most civilized, and that other races, particularly Africans, were inferior. Enlightenment scientists and philosophers disagreed, however, on whether that inferiority was permanent or not, and they were also unsure about whether blackness itself was permanent. Some, such as Voltaire, argued that God created the black race separately from the white race, and therefore any inferiority was probably innate and permanent. Other scholars, such as the French scientist Buffon, argued that skin color had to do with climate. So if you took a person from Africa and moved them to Sweden within a few generations, the dark skin would lighten and become white. Still other Enlightenment-era thinkers, like founding father Benjamin Rush, believed that perhaps leprosy had caused blackness, and maybe there was a cure for this. Jefferson was in the camp that suspected racial difference was permanent, and he therefore wrote that any interracial marriage would degrade the white race. Slaves should be freed, he said, and they were innately endowed with equal political rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, by their creator. However, since they were possibly racially inferior and definitely racially different, Jefferson also argued in his book that after slaves were freed, they should be colonized somewhere else, where they could govern themselves separately. Today, we Americans find this section of Jefferson's book deeply troubling. It is blatantly racist. But when Jefferson wrote those words, they were far less controversial. Indeed, he was repeating commonly held scientific views and beliefs. Moreover, individuals in the late 1700s had no conception of how different races could coexist in a republic. This was a fairly new experiment to be trying. Was it even possible? Many didn't think so. So advocating for freeing people and then colonizing them was not very controversial. What was controversial was advocating for ending slavery. Jefferson said slavery corrupted Virginian society. It was immoral, it was unjust, it had to be brought to an end, and if the slaves revolted and killed all the white people, Jefferson said, well, we deserve it. When Jefferson printed his book in France in 1785, he had reason to be optimistic that change was coming to Virginia. People were becoming sympathetic to abolition, as was already happening in several northern states. Christian groups like the Quakers and the Methodists were encouraging their members to free their own slaves and petitioning the legislature to abolish slavery. This period of success, unfortunately, was short-lived. By 1806, the tide had turned against emancipation. But in the 1780s, while Jefferson and Short were in Paris, it looked like there was a window of opportunity opening. So Jefferson wrote to several correspondents and said he wanted to take advantage of this potential shift in public opinion by sending copies of his book from France to Virginia. He knew the anti-slavery passages would be controversial. Perhaps legislators in Virginia would even act to restrict slavery even further. But he hoped if young men here at the College of William and Mary could read his book, they would be persuaded that slavery was evil, and then their generation could be the one to change things. He said, "It is to them I look, to the rising generation and not to the one in power for these great reformations." Well, William Short, next slide, was exactly the type of younger man that Jefferson was thinking about when he dreamed of reform. Short's father died when William Short was 19 years old, and Short came to live with the Jefferson family at Monticello. Jefferson tutored him in the law, and although Short quickly rose to prominence in Virginia and was on the governor's executive council by age 25, he gave up his career when Jefferson asked him to come to France and serve as Jefferson's private secretary. You see that quote there he wrote and said, "I don't mind the career setback. I'll be perfectly happy just to be with you." Like Jefferson, Short was a member of the elite ruling class in Virginia, and when his father died, he inherited land and slaves. But when he left America, Short only had one personal slave, a man named Stephen, and Short instructed his family to let Stephen be in charge of his own time and keep his own money, essentially freeing him. He seems to have, just like Jefferson, become anti-slavery while he was a young man. In Paris, Short and Jefferson were friends with some of the future leaders of the French Revolution, some of whom were also founders of France's anti-slavery society, people like Lafayette, Condorcet, Brissot de Warville. Although Jefferson said he could not join their anti-slavery society because he was in France as an elected delegate and he needed to pay attention to his constituents, Short did join this anti-slavery society, and he became an important voice linking anti-slavery advocates in America with those in France and England. Of the French abolitionists, Lafayette maybe did the most to actively pursue ending slavery. If Short became Jefferson's conscience on the issue of slavery, Lafayette, I think you could say, was George Washington's conscience on this issue. If you turn to the next picture, you'll see a picture there of Lafayette. In 1783, the year before Jefferson came to Paris, Lafayette wrote to Washington with a daring idea. He said, "Let us unite in purchasing a small estate where we may try the experiment to free the Negroes and use them only as tenants. Such an example as yours, George Washington, might render it a general practice. And if we succeed in America, I will cheerfully devote a part of my time to render the method fashionable in the West Indies. If it had been a wild scheme, I had rather be mad that way than to be thought wise on the other tack." Well, Washington apparently supported this, at least in theory, and Lafayette went back to France and then purchased, in June 1785, 70 African slaves and a cinnamon and clove plantation that he called La Belle Gabrielle in French Guiana, which is north of Brazil. Lafayette wrote to Washington and said he was going to free the slaves there and then attempt to implement a system of tenant farming on the property. Working as tenants, The slaves could learn the skills that they needed to govern their own lives, to make their own schedules, to become sufficiently self-disciplined to survive in a competitive free market. Or at least that was Lafayette's theory. And if this worked, other slave owners could perhaps be convinced that slave tenants were more financially profitable than enslaved workers. The summer that Lafayette began his emancipation experiment in 1785, Jefferson found himself discussing exactly the same topic at a lunch party outside of Paris. He was with some French and English reformers, and they asked him whether he thought adults who had been slaves all their lives had the capabilities to transition to free men. Jefferson wasn't sure. He recalled he had heard a few times about Virginian slaveholders who attempted to give slaves their liberties and set them up as tenant farmers. But they found, in Jefferson's words, quote, to give liberty to, or rather to abandon, persons whose habits have been formed in slavery is like abandoning children. The formerly enslaved workers had difficulty mastering the skills needed to become free people. Some became thieves, and they were re-enslaved. Still, despite these dismal rumors about emancipation that Jefferson had heard from Virginia, this lunch conversation he had in 1785 seems to have lit a fire underneath him. For the next several years, he and William Short spent a lot of time investigating the question of transitioning slaves out of slavery and into freedom, using tenant farming as an educational tool. We get some insight into Jefferson's thought process on this from a diary that he kept and some letters that he wrote while he was traveling through what we now call Germany in 1788. Jefferson saw all of these hard-working Germans, and he remembered how well German agricultural laborers had settled down in Maryland and Pennsylvania and assimilated into American society. So Jefferson wrote to Short and said, I have taken some measures for realizing a project which I have wished to execute for 20 years past without knowing how to go about it. I am not sure but that you will enter into similar views when I can have the pleasure of explaining them to you at Paris. Although Jefferson didn't say in the letter exactly what kind of project he had in mind, we get a clue from a letter that Short wrote to Jefferson a few months later. This time, Short was on a research journey throughout France and Italy. Apparently, the two men had decided that they were going to investigate a system of labor in Europe called Mitiage. This was an ancient form of sharecropping that was still being practiced in France and in Italy. In this system, landlords would give tenants tools and seeds, and then the tenants at the end of the harvest would usually give about half of the crop back to the landowner as payment. Well, Short and Jefferson decided Mitiage could be the answer to slavery in America. By turning slaves into tenants, slaveholders would theoretically give their workers their freedom, while at the same time retaining the agricultural laborers that they needed. Jefferson's travels among the hardworking agricultural laborers in Germany, combined with Short's research into Mitiage in France and Italy, resulted in Jefferson coming up with an extraordinary plan that you see on the next slide. As he described it in several letters, Jefferson thought his plantations in Virginia would be profitable enough to settle all of his outstanding debts in America. Once he finished his diplomatic work in France and returned permanently to Monticello, Jefferson said he would take advantage of his newfound financial independence by recruiting agricultural laborers from Germany, as many laborers as he had slaves. And then he was going to divide his property into farms of 50 acres each, and he would put equal numbers of Germans and slaves on each farm. The workers would all be placed, Jefferson said, on, quote, the footing of the métiers of Europe. Their children would grow up together in habits of property and foresight, as he put it, and therefore he had, quote, no doubt but that they will be good citizens. This is a remarkable plan because in it, Jefferson doesn't say anything about colonization. He uses the word citizens. Now, normally at this point in history, when people came up with plans to free a large number of slaves, they also talked about colonizing them to the middle of America, maybe, or to an island in the Caribbean, or back to Africa. But that's not what Jefferson was thinking of while he lived in Europe. He seems to have been imagining, along with William Short, a biracial future for this country. and importing German workers in order to help slaves learn to be free, or sharecroppers, seems to have been the first step in their plan. Jefferson might have put this plan into practice, except for two things. Shortly after he returned to America in 1789, he was recruited by Washington to serve as the first Secretary of State, and he had to leave behind his farms. And secondly, Jefferson learned his financial situation was way worse than he had anticipated. There was no way that Jefferson was going to make enough profit to get out of debt just based on farming. And to make matters worse, for the next 2 decades, Jefferson was frequently gone from Virginia, and his profits just went lower. He sunk deeper into debt. Another thing that did not prosper during this time was Jefferson's relationship with his adoptive son, Short. And there are 2 reasons for this: the French Revolution and women. Short had become involved with the wife of the Duc de la Rochefoucauld. She was a beautiful lady nicknamed Rosalie. Jefferson disapproved. He told Short, life as an unmarried man in Europe may be exciting at first, but having an affair outside of marriage would never give Short, or Rosalie, or anyone lasting happiness. Jefferson attempted to persuade Short to give up the affair, come back to America, find a nice American girl, settle down here. Short didn't listen. He kept trying with Rosalie until 1810. Well, Jefferson's authority might have been undermined, and his advice complicated by the fact that at this point in time, he may have begun an extramarital relationship of his own with his slave, Sally Hemings. Hemings arrived in Paris in 1787 as a companion for Jefferson's younger daughter, Maria. Sally Hemings might have lived in the same house as Short, Jefferson, her brother James, and a few other servants, or she might have lived at the convent with Jefferson's daughter where they were studying in Paris. According to an interview conducted years later with Sally's son, Madison Hemings, at some point before they all returned to America in 1789, Sally and Jefferson began a relationship, and Hemings' family tradition holds that she gave birth to a child in 1790, the year after returning from France. Madison Hemings later recounted his mother could have remained in France and been free if she chose, because the French law said if you set foot on French soil, you're free. And she knew that. But instead, she and Jefferson came to a mutual agreement, and she returned with him to her friends and family in Virginia, assured that she would have a comfortable life and her children would be freed when they reached adulthood. If Jefferson and Hemings did become involved in some way in Paris, Short might not have known, he was out of town a lot, or he might have been one of the only people to know that Thomas Jefferson's attitude on race relations was more complicated than it first appears. After all, if Jefferson could put aside what he had said about how race mixing is bad and act as though he actually believed that darker-skinned people were beautiful, desirable individuals, then perhaps other Virginians could come to that same viewpoint as well. In any event, as we shall see, Short's 1798 letter would take on great significance if, in fact, he did have knowledge of such a relationship beginning in Paris. The second problem between Short and Jefferson was the French Revolution. When Jefferson left France in 1789, the revolution had just begun, and Jefferson, as you probably all know, was very optimistic. He said the whole thing would be over really soon, minimum of bloodshed, and they would probably come to a constitutional monarchy somewhere between America and England. That didn't work. Almost immediately after Jefferson left, Short, who had stayed behind to pursue Rosalie, starts writing letters to Jefferson about the increasing levels of violence. For the next several years, Jefferson remained stubbornly committed to this idea that France would end up with a stable constitutional republic, while Short wrote more and more desperate accounts of mob atrocities and the execution of all of their friends. Even Lafayette didn't escape. He spent several years in jail, and his farm, La Belle Gabrielle, was seized by the French government, and all of those people re-enslaved. Many other members of the French Abolitionist Society were executed or died in prison. For months, the tension between Jefferson and Short caused them to stop communicating with one another. The main reason that they started up again was because Jefferson became really worried about Short's money. While Short was gone, Short's brothers sold most of the family slaves without Short's knowledge or consent, took some of Short's inheritance, and moved the entire family to Kentucky. Short felt abandoned. He was a Virginian without any reason to come back to Virginia. Well, Jefferson stepped in and became Short's business manager, and in 1795, he invested some of Short's remaining money and 1,000 acres of land right next door to Monticello, Jefferson's property. At the time, the land was called Indian Camp. Today, the University of Virginia owns it. You'll see it there on the map on the next page. It's called Morven, so if you look down toward the bottom where the red dot is, that's William Short's property. Jefferson hoped that one day when he finally retired, he could live surrounded by his grandchildren and by James Monroe, James Madison, and William Short, these men who were like sons to him. Well, Jefferson wrote to Short about the possibility of making money by renting plots of land to tenant farmers. And on the next page, you'll see Short's reply. Short says, "Thanks for buying me the land. That sounds great. If by tenanting you mean that humane and philanthropic system of renting land to the slaves in the way of metières, then it seems to me it would not answer my present purpose." This was because Short didn't own slaves anymore, and it would cost a lot to buy some. However, Short continued by saying, those who have the misfortune to own slaves should, for the sake of humanity, make the experiment. He seems here to be hinting that Jefferson should try this out. Free slaves, turn them into tenant farmers, not merely just to help those slaves develop the skills of free men, but this would also demonstrate to skeptical Virginians that freed workers could be just as productive and profitable as enslaved ones. Well, for the next 3 years, 1795 to 1798, their relationship was strained again. They barely sent any letters back and forth. Jefferson got deeply embroiled in American politics. Short was desperately in love with Rosalie. Rosalie was widowed because her husband had been murdered by a mob. Lots of drama for Short. But in February 1798, Short more than made up for all of these months of silence by writing Jefferson the letter of a lifetime. Britain had recently begun supporting a colony on the coast of Africa called Sierra Leone, and this was designed as a refuge for freed slaves and impoverished people of African descent who wanted to leave London and go live in Africa. Well, scientists and explorers had traveled from Sierra Leone to the interior of Africa, and they'd brought back these rumors of great cities, possible proof of advanced civilization. So Short wrote to Jefferson in complete excitement about this new proof of black equality. And if the two races were equally capable, what possible reason could there be for keeping them separate, as Jefferson had said in his notes on the state of Virginia? Short now fully believed emancipation did not have to be coupled with colonization. Black people could receive the full rights of citizenship in America, and marriage between the races would soon erase, quote, the marked and impassable color barrier between the two peoples. When Jefferson had first begun thinking and talking about emancipation back in the late 1770s and early 80s, he imagined that white people's prejudice, combined with justifiable resentment from black people, would make a biracial republic impossible. There would be too many tensions between the races, so colonization was imperative. Well, while he was living in Europe in the late 1780s, Jefferson started to dream about the idea that tenant farming could transition slaves into free men and a biracial republic could be possible. But by the late 1790s, Jefferson seems to have given up on this again. Well, Short, on the other hand, had stayed in Europe, and he used his experiences in Europe to make three important observations. First, Short had come to see that white Americans who grew up surrounded by slavery in the South were inevitably contaminated with prejudice. They were incapable of seeing clearly when it came to matters of race. They tended to always focus on the negative ways that slavery affected black people and their work ethic, rather than being open-minded about the possibilities for positive change brought by freedom. As a product of this culture himself, Short consciously positioned himself as an outsider when he wrote to Jefferson, recognizing that living abroad for so long had given him a fresh perspective. Second, Short noted that Spain had already tried a form of colonization. They expelled all Muslims, called Moors, in the early 17th century. The Moors often were skilled artisans, and Short said it was a mistake for the Spanish government to get rid of a valuable segment of their population, just like it would be a mistake for America to expel a large segment of its agricultural laborers. And finally, Short had learned one more thing from living in Spain all those years. If prejudiced Virginians' worst fears about the permanence of racial difference came true, they freed their slaves, and the black skin did not gradually change into white, well, then intermarriage would gradually do the work instead. In a few generations, Short assured Jefferson, quote, all of our southern inhabitants will advance to the middle ground between their present color and the black. Southerners would, after a few generations, have really nice tanned skin, like the Spaniards, who seemed to be doing pretty well despite their color. Well, if that generalization wasn't comforting enough for Jefferson, Short had a more personal example in mind, second to last picture that you have there. He brought up a well-respected woman named Frances Tucker, the wife of a College of William and Mary professor that they both knew, who apparently had a darker complexion than most Virginian ladies. I haven't found any evidence that Mrs. Tucker was of mixed race, but she apparently had this slightly darker skin tone and was very beautiful. Short argued she was, quote, the perfect mixture of the rose and the lily. There is no country, Short said, that would not be content to have its women look like her. It's possible that in making an example of Mrs. Tucker, Short was tactfully avoiding one that would have struck even closer to home for Thomas Jefferson, Sally Hemings, who was herself of mixed race and apparently very beautiful. She was described as mighty near white, very handsome with long straight hair down her back. If Jefferson had begun a relationship of some sort with her while they were in Paris, Short would have been one of the few people in the world to know for sure that Jefferson himself found darker-skinned women attractive. But knowing that their correspondence would easily be lost or published by unscrupulous post office masters, Short would never have actually said that in writing, so he hinted at it maybe with this reference to Mrs. Tucker. This is the closest we will ever get to an acknowledgement by Short that interracial relationships could easily happen in Jefferson's world. Before Virginians could be comfortable with this idea of their children marrying people of darker skin, they would first need to be persuaded about the equality of the races. So Short, once again in his letter, suggested the best way to speed up the process was by encouraging emancipation through the use of tenant farming. Jefferson was already renting out bits of that land at Indian camp to white tenants, but Short suggested that black farmers should be put on land next to white farmers, and then Jefferson should document and publish the results of the harvest. If free black people could produce as much as white tenants in a sort of scientific experiment, Virginians would have to admit that slavery was not really profitable, in addition to being morally wrong and dangerous. Short implied Jefferson needed to lead the way in turning public opinion, persuading white slaveholding Virginians through evidence that they wouldn't suffer financially if they freed their slaves. Short said, time and repetition will, I think, infallibly show the advantage of free, above-forced labor. What Short didn't know when he sent this amazing letter in 1798 was Jefferson was pursuing a step in this tenancy plan. As we saw back in 1788, Jefferson recognized that German farmers did a really good job, and he had talked about bringing them over from Germany to work side by side with black laborers. Well, in 1798, Jefferson started trying to recruit tenants from Maryland, where there was already a settled population of German immigrants. And he seems to have been thinking about breaking aside 480 acres of his land. He broke it into several plots, and he explained to a friend, quote, I find I am not fit to be a farmer with the kind of labor we have, meaning slaves, and implying he was ready to transition away from slave labor to free labor by using these German tenants. Unfortunately, at that point, there was a downturn in the economy in the North. People in Maryland didn't want to immigrate to the South, and Jefferson soon became distracted because he ran for president. In fact, Short didn't even get a reply from Jefferson about the more radical things he suggested in that 1798 letter. One explanation why Jefferson might have been silent on that topic is that right when he received this letter from Short, Sally Hemings had just given birth to a son, Beverly Hemings. And rumors about Beverly's paternity were already starting to circulate in the neighborhood in Virginia. If the father was Thomas Jefferson, it makes sense that he would not want to confirm in writing that he supported the idea of interracial marriage. To do so would quite possibly have derailed his chances of getting elected president because his letters were so often opened at the post office and made public. Short had to keep asking, and he did about once a decade or so, whether Jefferson still believed that colonization of free black people was the best solution. And eventually, a few weeks before he died, Jefferson did answer that question and said yes, he did still believe colonization was the solution. Well, as for Short, he retained his respect for Jefferson, despite the fact that Jefferson never followed through on this emancipation plan they had devised so many years earlier. Rosalie turned him down. So Short came back to America, and he visited Jefferson regularly until Jefferson's death. He invested in land, but he never tried tenant farming with freed slaves either, as far as I know. Instead, he became a millionaire, moved to Philadelphia, joined an abolitionist society, and at one point he tried to encourage intermarriage between the races in Philadelphia. Well, he was in for a rude awakening. Even in the city of brotherly love, where abolitionist sentiment was fairly strong, public opinion did not yet support racial intermarriage. As the abolitionist Roberts Vaux had to tell Short, quote, deep-rooted prejudice among Philadelphia's white presidents would prevent this from succeeding, and perhaps there would even be a legislative backlash, making conditions worse for free black people if they tried it. At the end of his life, Short gave up on encouraging intermarriage. Instead, he embraced Jefferson's solution, donating $10,000 to the American Colonization Society in his will. It seems that only while they were living in Europe were either of these two men able to look far enough into the future to believe that the two races could successfully live in freedom together. So now let me briefly turn to my second topic. Why is our collective memory of Thomas Jefferson so important to us as Americans? Jefferson has always been controversial. As one of his earliest biographers said, quote, it was the fate of Thomas Jefferson to be at once more loved and praised by his friends and more hated and reviled by his enemies than anyone else. In the election of 1800, John Adams's supporters said if Jefferson was elected president, there would be Bible burnings in the street, babies murdered on pikes, immorality everywhere. Well, Jefferson won the election. None of those things happened. And for a period of time, a lot of people gained respect for him. His party represented American liberty and democracy. Then in the years leading up to the Civil War, abolitionists used Jefferson's anti-slavery writings to support ending slavery. Pro-slavery advocates used his racist writings to support separation. And Confederate leaders, like Alexander Stephens, rejected Jefferson entirely, saying when he wrote all men are created equal, Jefferson was wrong. After the war, Jefferson's policies came to be seen as too supportive of states' rights, and Hamilton biographies became much more popular for a period of time. But by the Progressive era, Jefferson's advocacy for the Western farmer and for democracy made him popular again with a wide range of figures, from Frederick Jackson Turner to Woodrow Wilson. And when FDR dedicated the Jefferson Memorial in 1943, in the middle of the Second World War, he called Jefferson an apostle of freedom. Then came the Civil Rights Movement, and a very much needed reckoning with the way white historians had ignored the voices of Black Americans when they wrote history. Black voices like that of Madison Hemings, Sally Hemings' son, who said that Thomas Jefferson was his father. Many historians over the years rejected Hemings' story as completely unbelievable, but in the 1790s, that question was raised again. Last slide. In January 1998, the Monica Lewinsky scandal broke. Now, most of you in this room were too young to remember this. But Bill Clinton, the president, was accused of having an affair with an intern, and the affair was later proved through the use of DNA evidence. Well, later that same year, Nature magazine published an article about DNA testing with the headline, quote, Jefferson fathered slave's last child. This headline was misleading. The DNA does not prove that Jefferson fathered a child with Sally Hemings. What it does show is that a Jefferson male fathered Sally Hemings' youngest son. But the tone of the conversation in 1998, when this news broke, was extremely polarized. For some people, this was good news, showing that Jefferson and Hemings had a romantic love affair, or demonstrating that Bill Clinton wasn't the first person to have an extramarital affair, and so maybe it wasn't that big of a deal. For others, the headline was a travesty. It insulted the memory of a revered president, and still they said it was unthinkable for him to have had an affair at all, let alone with a slave. For others, the DNA evidence proved that Jefferson was a sadistic rapist. Today, the Hemings affair is probably just slightly less controversial than the fact that Jefferson was a slaveholder. At colleges, campuses around the country, before and especially after last summer, students have been arguing that any statue of Jefferson should be removed. And many of your college campuses, you're probably familiar with those movements. So why do we care so much about this guy? I believe it's because Jefferson represents some of both the best and the worst of America. Jefferson was not perfect by any means. William Short would tell us that Jefferson was a product of his time and place, a prejudiced man who struggled to see how abolition would actually work. Jefferson could perhaps have done more, said more, tried harder to free more human beings. Certainly, the nature of his relationship with Sally Hemings remains a troubling puzzle. And yet, he's one of the founders most responsible for the freedoms Americans enjoy to this day. A man who risked his life by writing and signing the Declaration of Independence when to do so was treason. A man who helped establish religious freedom. And I believe the evidence shows that Jefferson was an opponent of slavery who gave anti-slavery activists up to and including Abraham Lincoln some of that philosophical ammunition they needed to end the institution of slavery. Reflected in Jefferson, we Americans can see many things, but I believe the lesson for historians to take away from any study of Jefferson is that because he does represent so much to so many people, we have a special responsibility to be careful with what we write and say about him. If we believe in truth and we are aware of our own fallibility as humans, we must take care to note all the ways in which previous generations' biases have affected how they wrote about Jefferson before. In the past, historians covered up credible evidence that Jefferson fathered children with a slave. Today, we must be careful not to ignore credible evidence that Jefferson was a tremendous advocate for human freedom. Historians must learn to be comfortable with complexity and with paradox, and we must always remain aware of how the priorities and prejudices of our own time are affecting the ways in which we look and ask questions of the past. Only then will we be able to start to recover justice, liberty, and truth in an age of historical revolt. That is the end of what I have to say. Thank you. Okay, I think we're ready to start with the first question. And the sound people have requested, by the way, that everybody get close up to the microphone when you ask your questions. Thank you.
Hello. Good morning, ma'am. I thank you for your lecture. So at my table, we were just discussing there's been a lot of movement to I wouldn't say desecrate, but to maybe demolish a lot of statues and rename institutions and places. And how do we distinguish between a fine line of acknowledging history without commemorating the atrocities of that politician or whomever? For example, I know at West Point, actually, there are barracks named after General Lee. They're called the Lee Barracks, and I have several African friends who are very uncomfortable, and for obvious reasons, but then he was also an incredible officer, so how do we toe that line?
Such a good question. Obviously, there's no easy, simple answer to this. I think one of the privileges of living in a republic is that we get to have debates about who we want to commemorate and how and why. And I think an important part of the process is the debate that history belongs to all of us. History is all of our stories. And one problem that people have raised that I think is valid with certain memorials, for example, Confederate statues that predominate in a lot of southern states, is that those statues commemorate heroes who are not heroes to a large segment of America's population. To a large segment, they represent the group who wanted to keep us enslaved forever. Why would we want to have a statue of that person? And I think you could even broaden the case and say, why does America have statues and memorials up to people who fought to destroy the Union? That seems a little weird. On the other hand, there are people who would say, well, General Robert E. Lee was an incredible man. He was a man of character and integrity. Why would we want to destroy his memory? So there's not an easy and a simple answer to that. I think that it's important that we understand the context of the people that we are memorializing and that we don't blindly worship any hero. So I personally would like to keep up every statue of Thomas Jefferson because the bulk of Thomas Jefferson's life was dedicated to fighting for freedom, to fighting for equality. I think in many ways he was a man of character, not always, but I'm willing to weigh where he failed and where he was able to accomplish and to say, at his best, Jefferson set out an amazing image for America that is worthy of us celebrating. Yeah. So I would personally, I would like us to have a broad conversation about all of the aspects of a person's life rather than saying, well, he did this one thing wrong. So we're going to forget everything else that he did, and we're going to focus on that one thing. But on the other hand, I also want to have conversations about if there are memorials that were put up in a particular time and place. Say 1915, the KKK was on the rise again. People put up statues all across the South to commemorate Southern heroes and didn't talk about slavery and didn't talk about that aspect of the Civil War, then that statue seems to me a little bit misleading. And maybe we need to have a plaque next to the statue that says, this was put up to commemorate the Lost Cause, which is a myth not based on evidence, an interpretation of the Civil War that is very controversial. So that would be my personal preference, but I think we're going to be having this argument for a long time to come, and it's important that we have the argument. This is an important part of being a republic, is that we get to decide together, and hopefully we will be guided by truth and not the rage of the moment as we're making those decisions. So I don't know if that answers you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I think that's a question, the previous question that's on a lot of our minds, is we had a markedly similar one. So I'll try to take it in a bit of a different direction.
Thanks.
So at our table, we were talking about statues and buildings as well. And of course, an important principle for conservatives is the idea of human fallibility, that we have both good and evil in every human heart. So a question might be, do you think that an argument from human fallibility, and using that as an argument to still memorialize sinful and complex people, is that going to be convincing in kind of a second reality context that we've kind of discussed today about when talking with those who are ideological, who believe in inherent human progress?
Yeah, I am hopeful. I'm a little bit of a weirdo. I'm a very optimistic conservative. I am hopeful that eventually we're going to run out of the idea that you can have any perfect hero. That at some point cancel culture is going to run out of victims because none of us are perfect. And if we keep eating ourselves and don't have any grace and any context and any room for growth in anybody's life, we're going to run out of people to cancel. I'm hoping that that will happen at some point. So your question was?
Yes, so in discussing with those who would take down statues, often we're interacting with people who do not believe in human fallibility, believe in human progress.
Right.
So is the answer to
and so their critique might be, well, we cannot celebrate Jefferson, he owned slaves. That gets rid of all of the good things that he did. We need to get rid of him and any other person who owned slaves or who said racist things. And I understand where they're coming from, but my question for them would be, okay, what is your criteria then for somebody to commemorate? What are the standards that you are creating for a person that you're going to commemorate? Is your only standard that they weren't a racist? What if they said terrible things about women? What if they didn't support women's rights? Can we not commemorate them either? And I would also ask them have, as I think Dr. Federici said really well, was it you who said we need to have a global context for history? Or was that Dr. McClay? One of the august speakers who was here before me said, it's not enough to just study America, you need to study the history of the world. And so that's another question I would love to bring up when I debate this with people is, okay, I understand your critique of this particular figure. What was the rest of the world like? In 1776, slavery was legal everywhere. Everywhere. Indians had slavery, Africans had slavery, Asians had slavery. Western Europe, by and large, had gotten rid of it, but they were some of the only ones, and then they were participating in colonial slavery. It was remarkable that a man like Jefferson argued against it at all. And here we are tearing down his statue because we think he didn't do enough. Well, maybe he should have done more, but it's extraordinary that he did what he did. And if we hold people up to an impossible standard, we're creating an impossible standard for ourselves. So that would be the conversation I would hope to have.
It's very helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
Hello.
Hello.
Can I move this down a little bit? Is that going to make it yell at me? Okay. We also kind of used some of the ideas from the previous talk to frame our question. But how does the current kind of prevalent mentality of oppressor and oppressed impact the way we pursue those ideals of the Declaration? And is Jefferson an example of balancing that idealism of the second reality with the practical implementation of that first reality?
Okay, so how do we balance Jefferson? So are you saying people have mythologized Jefferson and they need to come back to the reality of the history of him?
Or is he an example of, in his writings especially, being an idealist, even if he couldn't always implement it in real life? And is that maybe a way that we can think of him and not throw out all of the good with the bad?
Yeah, great question. I think something that we might criticize Jefferson for is that he wasn't a utopian, but he came kind of close a few times, especially the whole French Revolution thing. I think Jefferson could get carried away with his optimism and his faith in progress. But in other ways, when we look deeper, I think you could make a case for Jefferson as a conservative. He looked back at the ancient Anglo-Saxon past and said, we need to get back to that vision of morality and liberty. And he had a strong belief that religion was important. So in order to preserve the morals of a republic. So yes, we need to look at Jefferson, the visionary, and measure him up against what he said he believed. And if he said he believed it and he didn't live up to his own standards, it is right to criticize him for that. But to me, he's also a fantastic example of how progress takes time. And you have to implement great changes slowly and practically, and sometimes you have a great vision for the future and you're not able to persuade all of the people around you. He's an example of a liberal whose ideas were so far ahead of him that he wasn't able to implement them all. And I think that's a great cautionary tale for people, that you can have a great vision for the future, but it's going to take time, and you need to not throw out the baby with the bathwater as you're attempting to implement that change.
Thank you.
Sure.
So my question's a little more practical. You said during your speech that Virginia's law has prevented Jefferson from freeing slaves at his death due to the debt that he had.
Yeah.
But there wasn't really a mention of his ability to free slaves during his life. Was that also prevented, or if not, well, why didn't he?
Great question. There was a window of time in the 1780s where, so when Jefferson inherited his slaves and through the first several decades of his life, the law said, you cannot free your slave. You have to, if you want to free a slave, go to the legislature and get special permission from the governor and the council to free a slave. So he legally could not free any slaves for the first few decades. Then he got wrapped up in the Revolution and went off to Europe. Now, while he was in Europe, there was this great window of time where he could have freed them. But remember, he was still in debt. And so he was thinking, how do I use my slaves' labor to get me to a position where I can then emancipate them? And so that was his plan throughout the 1780s. And in the 1790s, he gets super distracted by national politics, and his debts get worse. And then by the time that Jefferson comes back from the presidency and is once again at Monticello, The law in Virginia says if you free a slave, they have to leave the state within 1 year, and you cannot free a slave in your will if you're in debt. So Jefferson would say to people, well, I'm not going to free a slave, and then they would be a pest on society, a burden on society. He felt a responsibility to take care of any person that he freed. So that's why, for him, colonization, he would say, we need to educate them, train them, then send them out of the country so that they can be successful somewhere else. He wasn't willing to wholesale free people and just kind of let them go and hope that they made it to a successful life somewhere else. Now, was he doing this because he genuinely cared about those individuals, or was he doing this because he needed their labor to get him out of debt? Question mark. I don't know. So there were brief windows of time where he could conceivably have freed more slaves. If he had done so, he would have lost money. And in his mind, the goal was always, let me totally get out of debt and let me totally change Virginian society, and then I will free all of them. And that didn't happen. So he kind of coulda, shoulda, would've, didn't.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So my question's kind of similar to the statue question that's been brought up before, but I was wondering, since you have the experience of being a professor at a college, how do you see, from your perspective, education specifically changing towards a more polarized, one-sided view of history, with the example of like the 1619 Project and that sort of thing? And do you have any recommendations for maybe how college students can combat that sort of thinking?
Wow. I'm really lucky to teach at a college where I'm given freedom in the classroom to teach what I want. So my position is perhaps different than a professor at a different school who maybe feels under more constraints in what they are able to say in the classroom. It definitely feels as though the trend among historians has been to view history through the lens of oppressors and oppressed. And I believe that this is a terrible mistake because it causes us to read back into the past our own political concerns. And then we make mistakes. Then we see a situation, so for example, the 1619 Project would argue that America has been racist and based on slavery since its founding. And it chooses 1619 as the starting year for telling America's story because that's when the first enslaved individuals arrived in Virginia. But if you look into that story more closely, you discover that those individuals were not the first African slaves to come to North America, first of all. And second of all, those individuals most likely did not remain enslaved for all their lives. In the early 1600s in Virginia, lots of people were not free, white, black, native, and they worked side by side in the fields, and sometimes the African enslaved people got their freedom. And some of those people owned other people and went to court to keep their rights over those other people. There was a hierarchy of unfreedom that was not yet based on racial slavery. And we would miss those details and miss the intricacies of what happened in Virginia when race-based slavery started if we read back into the past, well, all white people are racist and always have been and always will be. That's oversimplifying the issue, and you're missing the context and the nuance and what could have happened and what did happen. So I think it's a real tragedy for the historical community that politics has become so infused in our present conversation. And I think if I were a student, what I would be trying to do in my classes is read the original documents as much as possible. Don't rely on the textbooks or the lectures to teach you history. Find the sources yourself, and what you'll find might surprise you. And I think I myself, I try really hard not to be biased, but as I said, I'm fallible. I recognize that I'm fallible in my politics, my religion, my viewpoint. I always want to be aware of that when I'm approaching the past so that I'm fair to the past, so that I don't distort the past in any way because of my own biases or my own agendas. And that's all any of us can hope to do. And hopefully one day that will once again become a priority of the historical community. But the best way that we can all do that is go to the past and read those documents on their own terms.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rodgers, for being here. I hate to ask you the same question you've been asked like 5 times.
It's okay.
But I'm going to try to flip it on its head a little bit. So on the right, we have a tendency to over-idealize and revere the founders, perhaps to an unhealthy degree. How do we respect and appreciate the good of Jefferson and the other founding fathers while allowing room so that they don't have to be perfect beings?
Well, I think if you read about Jefferson's life, you will find a lot of flaws. If you studied Washington's life, you will discover he had a bad temper. And yeah, that might be the only thing wrong with Washington, actually. I think the more that you study these individuals, the more you see that they're gloriously human. And that, again, I'm the hopeful person. That gives me so much hope that they were so flawed. And like John Adams, and he's such a curmudgeon, and he's such a grouch. But I love him because he's so honest. And he and Jefferson hated each other's guts, and they had this awful political fight, and they trashed each other's reputations nationally, and it was one of the most divisive elections in American history. And then they were able to reconcile and write each other beautiful letters and come to understand one another's positions in their old age. What a great example for us that they were human, they were flawed, they were messed up, they were biased, they misunderstood, they were mean to one another, they hired tabloids to trash one another's reputations. Sounds really familiar, right? And yet, they give us a beautiful example of going back to first principles and reconciling, forgiving maybe even a little bit. So I think approaching the founders not as if we can never see people like that again, but recognizing that they are just as flawed as you and me, but look what they were able to accomplish. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we can model our lives on them in what they were able to do well?
Thank you.
Good question, thanks.
So my question is, Jefferson and Short, as children of the Enlightenment, how do they go about justifying the Mitiage system? I know Mill's critique was that in many ways it revealed the medieval feudalist system in Europe at the time, and it just seems kind of odd for them to be advocating for something that seems pre-Enlightenment.
Great question. You're right. There were Enlightenment philosophers who wrote about this system and said it's terrible, it's not fair. Jefferson, when he went around France and studied it, he wrote to Lafayette and said, "You're not manuring your fields often enough." Sorry to bring up poop this early in the morning, but they weren't manuring their fields often enough because the tenure that they would give to a sharecropper would be so short. The sharecropper had no incentive to improve the land before he'd be moved to another field somewhere. And so Jefferson said, well, you need to reform this, maybe model it on England where a tenant has right to stay on the land for his whole lifetime, and then he'll try to improve the land. So he recognized it is a flawed system, it's not ideal. Jefferson ultimately believed every person should own land and have the virtues of an agricultural, of a farmer. But how do you get from slavery to freedom? Jefferson was trying to investigate ways to transition the economy. And so I think for him, this would only be a temporary measure. This would be a way to kind of give slaves the education and the training that they needed so that they would be kind of free, but not totally free. And it would give slave owners the labor, but without the slavery. And his hope was that in time, they would move from slavery to freedom, to land ownership and full citizenship. So it was just temporary, because you're right, it's not an enlightened concept at all.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hello. So our group's question was whether it was a unique American attribute to be uncomfortable with the complexities and paradoxes of flawed historical figures, and then whether or why do we search for the perfect historical being?
Humans like good guys and bad guys. You know, we like watching a movie where the story is really clear, and you can tell who the bad guy is and you can tell who the good guy is. I think the tendency, if I look at the way that histories are written around the world, is for national scholars to write historical myths, and they tend to only write about the good stuff. I'm going to pick on Japan for a second. Japan reckoning with the war crimes of the Second World War. That's an ongoing process. It's very difficult, I think, maybe even contrary to our first inclination as humans, to look at the bad stuff, to tell the ugly, dark truths about the crimes that your ancestors commit. I mean, think about your own personal life. None of us wants to be descended from an axe murderer, right? I'd much rather be related to George Washington than Jack the Ripper. And so it can be very disillusioning when you do your DNA, your ancestry test, and you find all those skeletons in the closet. Maybe you're a little bit embarrassed of some of them. We'd rather have heroes in our past because we create our identities based off of our past and our understanding of the past. And nations do that too. So I think it's interesting, actually, that America seems to be beating itself over the head the last few decades. The move has gone in the opposite direction, and it's all about the bad and not about the good. This to me seems a little bit suicidal, to continually be looking for the worst and never recognizing the good that your ancestors did. So maybe you all can help me understand, why are we doing that? What's going on there? That can be an interesting topic for conversation. Did I answer your question well?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. I'm currently a student at Mr. Jefferson's University, so I certainly have an interest in preserving his legacy.
That's
But,
University of Virginia, for those of you who don't know. Yes, okay.
the greatest school in the country. But anyway, so I think Jefferson's idea of freedom is very much connected with his endorsement of property ownership, and especially an agrarian way of life.
Yeah.
So perhaps how do we think about Jefferson's idea of freedom? And I mean, that's one of the reasons he, was sympathetic to colonization, because it would at least give black people some amount of ability to have land to improve their lot.
Right.
So in a kind of very post-agrarian, even post-industrial society, how do we recover that association of freedom and property that Jefferson had?
How can we have agrarian values when we no longer live in an agrarian society? Is that basically your question?
Yeah.
Gosh. Well, don't live in a city. That would be Jefferson's first answer. Cities corrupt your morals, and they make you want to dress nicer like everybody else, and sleep with your neighbor's wife, and do all sorts of bad things to you. So don't live in a city. Try to stay rural. I think that would be one of his first answers. Yeah, I don't have a great answer to that question, because the world has changed so far beyond the world that Jefferson was born into. And even while he was alive, when he was born, the fastest that any human being had ever gone was the speed of the fastest horse. And by the time he died, steam engines have been invented, and they're on their way toward trains. And now, look, we've gone to the moon. The world has completely altered in the last couple hundred years. So I'm going to have to keep thinking about that. How else can we continue to implement agrarian values? Apart from not living in cities, I think that Jefferson always wanted individuals to have as much self-government as possible. And so what he liked about living on a farm was it made you self-reliant and it made you interested in your community. He said, keep the local group as involved in their own self-government as possible, keep the power at the top as limited as possible. So he would maybe argue for a limited government to persist in today's society, and argue that that's another way that we can attempt to cultivate those virtues. But yeah, that's my best answer for you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Having been a champion of political equality his whole life, and with the current political climate towards radical equality of material condition, do you foresee resurgence of Jefferson's national image in this ideological lens?
Wait, radical, say that again, what was he, radical?
A current political appetite towards radical equality of material condition.
That's our current appetite,
Yes.
or his?
Oh, our current one.
Okay, for a second I thought you were talking about Jefferson. I don't think that was him. Okay, so I'm sorry, say the whole question one more time.
So since Jefferson was...
I was mad on Jefferson's behalf for a second, so I have to calm down.
I'm
All right,
sorry,
I'll
I'm
listen
sorry.
properly now.
I was a little unclear. Since Jefferson's kind of a champion of political equality throughout his lifetime, and even that now we have such a push for radical equality of material condition, do you think it's going to happen that Jefferson will be recast in this kind of ideological lens of warrior of equality?
Oh, no, because he owned slaves. I can't see anybody trying to transform Jefferson into a hero for like redistribution of property or radical equality because everybody is too stuck on the fact that he owned slaves and he was a racist. That would be interesting, though, an interesting kind of try to resurrect his reputation in another way. And that has happened, I think, in the past. You can find examples of Americans arguing that he's a radical Democrat and that he was the one who did the most for the common man and the most to create a more equal society. I think maybe in a few decades we'll see what you're talking about, because the shape that people can put to Jefferson's personality according to their current needs seems inexhaustible. So we'll see.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We do have time for one more question, so if anyone has, Caleb, you're up.
I was wondering, personally, what would you say the conservatives should take from Jefferson? Because in the Kirk reading, he doesn't want to touch Jefferson at all. He says he was totally inconsistent, and he's more focused on John Adams, and he just, kind of casts off Jefferson. I'm wondering, is there more to Jefferson's story than just him as a human having inconsistency and appreciating that? Is his ideas, should we as conservatives take more than just this is a broken man, and we should reflect on him as a broken individual because he reminds us of our brokenness?
Yeah, great question. I think that there is more overlap between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson than might first appear. And so when you read the John Adams chapter in the Russell Kirk book, Jefferson and Adams came to agree, not on everything. Jefferson would say that John Adams was too British in his acceptance of different classes, maybe. But in other ways, they had a lot of similarities. And Jefferson also believed in governance through aristocrats. He just argued that they needed to be natural aristocrats who deserved leadership positions and weren't born to leadership positions. I think that if you are somebody who values freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, if you are somebody who believes in a more limited federal government, then Jefferson might have a lot to say that would be of interest to you. Absolutely. I absolutely think that he has a lot of conservative attributes. And as I mentioned earlier, there were aspects of Jefferson where he did believe that he was reaching back to an ancient English society, and he used a lot of English tradition and English constitutions in order to defend his vision for America's future. He actually wanted to stop progress from happening in the sense that Jefferson was an agrarian and he didn't want to go to the Hamiltonian vision of a very commercial future. He thought that would bring corruption to our civilization. He wanted to freeze us in the agricultural phase. So yeah, there are absolutely conservative leanings that you can find in Jefferson.
Awesome, thank you.
Now feel free to come up to me and tell me how wrong I am later on. That's fine.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rodgers.
Thank you all.